Well, welcome everyone. This is the last session of today's leadership workshop. Thank you so much for sticking around. I think this will be a really excellent presentation, very topical and relevant to these times. So before I jump in, or I hand it over to Elaine, just a reminder that you can participate in chat at any point. And this session is recorded, will be recorded and shared afterwards if you would like to refer back to it. As well as the slides will be made available. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Elaine Westbrooks, Vice Provost and University Librarian at UNC-Chapel Hill.
Thank you. I just want to thank all of you for attending. Here in Chapel Hill, it's a beautiful day. It's like 72 degrees. It's just wonderful. So in light of the wonderful weather we're having, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can go right ahead and do this presentation. Okay. So I came up with this topic because this is something that is truly impacting my organization right now. I have a lot of vacancies and the turnover. Even before the pandemic, we were experiencing a transition. And now after the pandemic, we really have some challenges ahead of us. And so I wanted to do my own research and then also bring some ideas that we hope to implement at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So let's dig right into it. So for today's session, we'll cover these 6 areas. And this gives you a sense of, well, what is the Great Resignation? There's a lot of data out there that tells us that there indeed, in fact, is a problem that we have. And then what are the reasons behind people who are stepping away from their work? And then I want to talk about how we respond to this moment is really important. I mean, I think some people think this is horrible. I don't have to deal with this. And on the other hand, you could think of this as a tremendous opportunity, that this is a gift. And then the 5th thing I want to talk about is how we're going to have to rethink about the work, but also how the work fits into our organization, our mission, and what our staff need from us. And then the final one is just managing in the moment. What are things that we could do in the short term, the midterm, and the long term? Because, this pandemic eventually will go away, right? But the legacy of this pandemic will be felt for years and decades to come. So it's not like we're going to say, oh, all that stuff we did, we were, we're caring and compassionate, empathetic about our library staff, that we're just going to stop doing that and we're going to go back to the way it was before. So that's clearly not what we want to do. So let me just move on. But one thing I do want to state as a fact is this Great Resignation is something that transcends everything. I mean, it's every part of society, every sector is being impacted by this phenomenon. And it's going to take extreme measures to retain our staff and get the most critical work done with the necessary staff. So let's talk about that term, Great Resignation. And so it's not that old. I think this was back maybe in last year in the spring, where a Texas A&M professor named Anthony Glotz coined the term in an interview, I think it was with Bloomberg, and it just took off and people started using it. But as you know, it is about the mass quitting spree of American workers, and to the tune of about 4.4 million people. And this is that moment where we were all at institutions and organizations that froze hiring, right? And so there was a intentional freeze. And then once the freeze was lifted, and in some cases it's not fully lifted, we have a very different situation here. The other part, we could look at it as the emergence of a labor shortage, even though we should be able to find plenty of people for all the work we have. And as I mentioned, this is happening regardless of what sector, what part of society you're talking about. And then the other aspect of it is, it's not just the people who have left, it's the people who are thinking about leaving that is also a big challenge for organizations. So here's the numbers, and you can look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so you'll see on the right side on that line, that was the pandemic, right? And so of course, the people were forced out of jobs because, you know, restaurants were closed, libraries were closed, a lot of our society was closed. And so then it shoots up. And now, like at September 2021, it was about 4.43. And that's about the number that people are looking at. And I have looked at the data about states where they had more aid from the government and more ways to help pay for rent, things like that. And then they looked at the data from states that didn't. And it actually is not, you can't say that states where people had more aid were less likely to go back to work. That's not really true, because we also looked at, there are states that have continued to aid up until this spring, and they looked at those states and compared them to other states. So that's not really the case, but they do, a lot of the research says that that did have an impact, but was it a significant impact? Doesn't seem to be so. So, you know, a lot of people are basically saying, you look, I'm out of here. And I want to take a look at the numbers, because I want you to understand the depth of the problem. And also that there are a lot of economists, organizational psychologists, there are people in HR and business who are really looking at this challenge, because it is going to, like I said, it's going to really change the face of how we run our businesses into the unforeseeable future. So, as I said, or alluded to, we have 40 to 75% of the workforce are actively planning to leave their current jobs. So if you can imagine that, and I know many of you, we're representing all parts of library, public libraries, community colleges, university libraries. And if you could, for some of you, if you lost 3 people, that would be a major impact on your organization. As of the end of September, there are 10.4 million job openings. So there are a lot of jobs out there, and people don't want a lot of these jobs. And that's a major challenge. Of course, the leisure and hospitality industry has experienced the most impact. And that's, of course, restaurants, hotels, and things like that, with the quit rates of 43%. I wanted to also note that the higher paid positions like administrators, CEOs, people like that, the quit rate is a lot lower, right, than the lower paying jobs or what were considered blue collar. Those are 2 different areas, but there is a higher quit rate among the highest paid officials. And then, of course, the manufacturing quit rates are as high as 78%. And then I think the key part is over 5 million Americans have left. And I was also looking at women, and women have been disproportionately impacted because women represent a higher percentage of leisure and hospitality. And women tend to be in the lower paying jobs. And so women have an interesting situation, because also for childcare, many of us had to step back because there wasn't a reliable childcare option. And so we had to stay at home to take care of our families. And so I think I have some statistics on that a little bit later. But I think and the other final part I want to mention is retail is another area that is really struggling. And if you go to the mall or anywhere, you'll just see hiring signs everywhere. I mean, this is a real major problem. And if you go to a restaurant, you're going to notice it because the service is slow. If you go to get your car fixed, if you go, like, I see it wherever I go. I don't feel like the quality of service is very good. And I think it's largely because there aren't enough people. Okay, so I just wanted to, there are about over 20 of us on this call. And I would like to hear some of your thoughts, and I encourage you to put them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand. But some of you are already experiencing some of this, and I wanted to hear from you directly some of the reasons that you've heard that people are leaving your library. So I'm going to pause here and look at the chat and see if anyone is brave enough to share some of the things they've learned. Not enough flexibility. Yes. Number one thing, as you all know, people like working from home. I'm working from home right now. That's the number one reason why people are struggling to get back to work. Second one, finding better paying jobs in the private sector. Absolutely. People are definitely know that they have a lot more, what's the word? People know that the market, the way the market is going, that they can go out and get jobs that pay much better. People are leaving because the pay is too low. Absolutely. Particularly in our sector, the rates, the market, we're not paying people cost of living. We're not paying people for, the inflation that's going on. Low morale and burnout. Absolutely. That is a reason. People were reflecting and thinking their lives over the pandemic. Internal promotion and then position is frozen. Absolutely. Many of us are working 2 or 3 jobs because people have left. The cost of living is, I mean, we all noticed when we were forced to work from home, how much money you saved on gas, how much money you saved on eating out. What else? Focusing on personal family life. Absolutely. A lot of people said, you know what? I have lost loved ones over this pandemic, and I want to spend the rest of my life not working at this job, but spending time with my family and making the most of the last years on this planet. Lack of benefits and leave time. Absolutely. I mean, there's no paid leave in this country and nonprofit sectors. It's just almost impossible to get paid leave. And until we do something about that, we're going to see women particularly leaving jobs at record rates. I think I looked at all of them. So one person said, so far we've not had anyone leave except with the retirement incentive. Yeah. Well, what I would say is, just wait. I just can't imagine someone's gonna leave at some point. Because the other thing that happens is people see other people in their organization leaving, and then they're like, wow, like that person left and they're making more money. They're happier or whatever. I think I should do that. But if you don't see a big jump or people leaving, that's great. I mean, one thing I mentioned or didn't mention is the fact that retirement is a big part of it as well. The profession is growing, the baby boomers are retiring, and that's a large amount of people who are leaving. So you all touched on, following passions. You just decided you just didn't want to come back to that same job, and you wanted to do something. You wanted to be an artist, or you wanted to open up a restaurant, or you wanted to do something like that. So thank you. You've all named pretty much all the reasons why people are leaving. Okay. So this is an image from there was a great interview on NPR. This is the image from that interview about why people are leaving. And as someone had already mentioned, at one point, you had 27 to 52% of people who are working from home. And these people felt that this is a good way of living, right? And that the time that you're not commuting, you get to save that time and you get to use it for work. The flip side is a lot of people felt like they were living at work, right? And so you worked longer hours. You never got away from your job because there was no disconnection between home life and work life. Okay, so why are people quitting? Burnout which was already mentioned. And the term burnout, I think, is really interesting because it suggests that it's on that individual. And what I really think what happens is burnout. It's not an individual is they just get up one morning and they're burned out. It's the organization that um, that is, in some cases oppressing its workers. In other cases, it's just the environment. It could be a crappy supervisor. I mean, there's so many reasons why people could get um, burned out. And I think that we see that in our profession, lack of childcare. Inflation is the newest one, of course. As we all know, the inflation rates are just eating up our resources. And so now we have to figure out ways like, do I need to go and get another job? While it's taking me $50 to fill a tank of gas. And particularly if I'm going to go out and find a job where I can work from home. We mentioned the pandemic epiphanies of, do I really want to continue doing this work for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years? Another one is the career downsizing. Some people who have, high pressure jobs, stressful jobs, and they just decide that they want a job with less responsibility. And they're willing to take less money to do something that is less stressful. The competitive workplace market obviously is a big one, as that your skills are in demand and you're going to go somewhere else and make more money for doing, in many cases, the same work you're doing now. Of course, number 7, people want to stay at home. The baby boomers are retiring. In terms of that pandemic epiphany, the way you were treated at the beginning of the pandemic is important. And if you were at an organization and they kind of told you that, you didn't matter, and that, if you go to work and get sick, that's, it's no big deal. Like those are things that people are looking at. And if they felt that their organization was not operating in their best interest and made you unsafe, those are like folks are saying, look, they didn't value my safety. I think I need to go elsewhere where I can be appreciated and valued. Then, of course, the low wages is one. And then the vaccine mandates is really small amount of people, but there's some people who are just saying, look, this is not what I want to do. And I'm getting forced to do it. And so I just rather quit, retire early, or go find a job where I don't have to get vaccinated. Okay, so one thing I could say about the why is, one thing I forgot to mention is that for people, for a job that's posted that says that you can work remotely, you're going to get 2.5 times as many people applying for a job that is posted for remote work as opposed to a job where you have to work on site. So there is no question that people want the flexibility to work from home, right? So I already covered a lot of this, but I just wanted to look at it in 4 buckets. The first one I mentioned is the competitive market. Workers have clout. They don't have to stay in the jobs that they have now. They know they can go and get new jobs. One thing I wanted to mention, which I haven't heard anyone talk about, is IT staff. I have an IT department and they are extremely hard to retain. They are competing with with amazing companies in the Triangle area. They're able to work in Indiana and not have to move. And as I mentioned earlier, university salaries, community colleges, and public libraries have in no way kept up with the cost of living, inflation, and all the other market pressures. And then what we do know is for everyone who leaves their job, you can count on a 5% increase in your wages. That's pretty much across the board. Whatever kind of job you do, if you leave, you are likely to get a 5% raise or increase. And depending on the sector, if you go back to like restaurants, you might get a 20% or 30% increase because the demand for workers is so high. As I already mentioned, the pandemic epiphanies, there's a status quo bias, and that people who have low wage jobs consistently and historically underestimate how bad their jobs were. And so there's a bias to say, okay, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. It's not so bad. Then of course a global pandemic hits and then you become, you open your eyes to to what you've been doing, and that you don't want to remain in the status quo. You need to make a change. We want a different way of life. And we want to, I talked about the downsizing. We want to reduce the level of responsibility that we have. And then finally, is this the right job for me? Is this how I want to spend the next 15 years of my life? The third area is the quality of work and the work life. And I would say in my organization, I have so many vacancies. I'm very concerned about people getting burned out because they're just working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to fill in for the people who have retired or who have left. Another area is, of course, the lack of trust in organization and leadership. If you, especially coming back after the pandemic, and you just don't have confidence that your organization and your leadership cares about you or is moving in the right direction, that's of course going to reduce the quality of your work life. And you don't feel valued or appreciated. You want to follow suit with the people you know are leaving and are getting that 5% bump or more. The workplace flexibility, as I mentioned, is key. People feel disenfranchised if they don't know what's going on in their organization. They don't know how to add value and to contribute. And then, of course, there's a lack of opportunities. You're in the same job and you want to do more. You want a different kind of job. Is your organization committed to helping you do that? Okay, so the term Great Resignation is the one that people have been using, but a lot of people are also calling it the Great Reshuffle and the Great Rethink. But I wanted to at least put that out there that it's a little more complicated than people just want to quit. Okay, so is this massive exodus of staff a major problem for us? And is this something that we want to embrace and reinvent ourselves, or is this something that we're going to try to fight and try to continue to do what we're always doing? And of course, you know that I'm going to cover the first part, which is this is a wonderful, tremendous opportunity for organizations. Okay, so according to the VP of Product Management and Talent at LinkedIn, we have to rethink everything that we're doing. And if we just say we're going to ride this out, and when this pandemic is over, we're going to go back to what we used to do, that's never going to work. So we have to change, organizations have to change their business and how they work with their employees. So I'm suggesting we need a new chapter for libraries, and that it's never gone back to the way it was. And the way it was wasn't so great, right? Status quo was not good enough. We need to transform the face of work, what it looks like, what we ask people to do and how they do it. And if we don't, we will suffer and we will not be able to fulfill our mission. And there are mission critical work that would not get done if you don't have people doing the work that you need done. So transforming the face of library work. Let's talk about that. Let me catch up with my notes. Okay, the first thing that we already mentioned is this opportunity to do remote work. Now, at my organization, I'm at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm part of a system of University of North Carolina public schools, and we're subject to the laws of that system. And so, although I would love it to be my decision to say, okay, people can work from home, we're going to be much more flexible, I have to follow some of the rules of the system. The problem is the system is not being flexible enough, right? The system, the UNC system has fallen behind on what our workers need and what would help us be much better organizations. And so I'm in a tough situation because I'm trying to push our system to really rethink the policies and to say, if we do not start being more flexible with working arrangements, we are going to continue to lose people. And so I know that the system knows that there are too many people leaving, and it's alarming for many organizations. And so that means that we have to look at the workspaces. So in my case, I would love to be able to repurpose some of the space that we have used for staff. And if staff are working from home 3 days a week, and and then we were able to find some joint spaces, we would not need as many office spaces in our library, and we could return that space to partners, to students, to other groups on campus who need to have that space on site on campus. Um, the second is we have to rethink the culture and values that our staff have, and how do we think about those? And I have to admit, when I would say 3 years ago, if you had asked me um, whether or not I liked remote work, I would have said no. No, it's not some, I think productivity goes down. This is not, this is under, certain cases and has to be approved, like that's how I felt about it. And right now, of course, I do not feel that way at all. We have demonstrated through this pandemic that people can be productive, and that some people, not everybody, actually are more effective working from home than on site. Um, and then, of course, as I mentioned, 87% of people would prefer to stay remote at least half of the time. That's what the LinkedIn survey says. I'm going to pause and look at some of the questions. Okay, these are still things about why people leave. Okay, now this is probably the most controversial thing I'll say in this entire presentation. I think we have to shift towards skill-based hiring. And the reason why this is controversial is if you jump to conclusions, right? I am not saying that the library degree doesn't matter. And I'm not saying we're going to hire everybody as long as, they don't have to have an MLIS or MS or MSIS or MLIS. I think the library degree is important. However, I think it's really important that we rethink how this credential is used in hiring, and that we are more broad and inclusive. And so in my 25-year career in libraries, I've hired some of the most amazing people, and the bulk of them do not have library degrees, right? They're extremely talented, and they have the potential, and they have great experiences that are important and make them valuable within the library, right? So we have to start looking at the skills that people have, and not really, and not only credentials and experience. So what we have to do is we have to shift towards hiring people who will grow and develop and have a great deal of potential, as opposed to people who we know can hit the ground running, we don't have to train, and they can do the job. And I would say at the same time, when we hire people, we have to ascertain the kind of skills that they have and match those skills to the work that we need done. And so we have to rework our job advertisements and descriptions and make them more skill-based, right? And I think the first thing we do is you got to have an MLIS, and you got to have this many years of experience. And oftentimes that will eliminate half of your pool right there. So I think that this is something, the way we describe the work and the skills that are necessary to complete jobs, we don't often talk about the skills. We talk about everything else but the skills that people have, or we just don't talk about them in a very meaningful way. And as I mentioned, the skills and everything you have, it will not always come from the last 3 jobs that you worked at, or the program that you just attended, the library schools that you attended, that's where you're going to learn everything to make you successful on this next job in the library. As I mentioned, we need broader pools of talent if we're going to fill these vacant positions. And we also need to be more inclusive so that we can hire a more diverse, broadly set of people for our organizations. And that requires that we have to rethink like our search committees. And our search committees are kind of programmed to want people who we know can do the job because they used to do the same job somewhere else, right? And so that's going to be a significant shift to say we have to really think our our process. Do we really need to do telephone interviews? Do they need to be on site? Can we do it over Zoom? What are different ways that we can really think about bringing in talent to our organization? And then the final point is the onboarding is really important, that we spend more time. I mean, really, people basically decide whether or not they're going to stay in an organization in the first 3 months. So the first 3 months on the job, you really have to work on people to understand, how are you doing? What's surprising to you? What do you really want to achieve in this job? What's not working for you? What's working for you? And to really think about mentoring people and helping them be more successful. The third part is the reskilling and upskilling. And by that, I mean, reskilling is helping people who have a job, helping them get skills in their workplace to be better at their current job. Upskilling is helping people get new skills so that they can go up in a new kind of job, right? This is critical that we do more of this, and we provide more opportunities for our staff. The second thing is that the training and development work is really an incentive and reward for great performance. The third thing is that if you want to enhance the knowledge and skills through training, that is really the only way you can do it. And I always say, would you rather give people the training and they leave, or not give people the training and they stay? Think about it. I rather train people, because a lot of people say, oh, if you train people, they're going to leave. Well, that's going to happen, and that's perfectly fine. But it's totally unacceptable to say, I'm not going to train anyone and you're just going to stay in your job and do the same work you've always done. And we know that for those of you, I've been in this business for 25 years, the amount of automation, the work we do has changed drastically in the past 25 years. And so the commitment to training is really important, that the people we hired who are largely doing print books and materials, we have transitioned, particularly in research libraries, to a lot more digital content. And so are those people having the skills necessary to manage, manipulate, acquire, organize digital content, which is very different than the analog content, which we had collected for decades. And then the final point is about the efficiency and productivity of trained staff. It's an investment in your organization. And I know when I first came to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, that was one of the first things I did was increase the funding that people got for professional development. And I also made it possible for largely the staff who are not librarians to have more resources, so they could definitely go to one meeting and not have to come out of pocket. Because we had a system where you can get so much money and so much money, but you know, $600 is never going to be enough to attend a conference, right? And I don't want people who are going to, you know, go broke trying to go to a conference, or they're going out of their way to save money when they really should be focused on learning. And so training, I cannot stress how important training is now, and now it's going to be in the next couple of years. The final one, this is actually the toughest one, is the whole trust idea and the importance of it. During the pandemic, some people did lose trust and faith in their organizations because they thought their safety was not a priority. And at the end of the day, if there is no trust, and by trust, I mean there has to be confidence, there has to be understanding that the organization and leadership has the skill and capacity to lead, and there also has to be goodwill, right? Like you have to have all of those things to be trustworthy, and that you can have the capacity but not have the goodwill, you're not going to be trusted, right? And so trust is really, really important. And also the empathy that people were shown during the pandemic. And I just remember, seems so long ago, but in the midst of the pandemic, I remember telling people when we were working from home, Like, I was like, you know what? We're not going to worry about productivity right now. Your job is to take care of yourself and your family, because this is the point. This is before vaccines. You could go out, you felt like you were risking your lives. And so we felt like, we're not going to, nail people on productivity. And even in the performance management process, we had to show a lot of compassion and empathy because people were really suffering. People who had family members who were dying. And it was just a really tough, stressful, and it continues to be tough and stressful for people who had young children at home, people taking care of their parents. So that support and trust is going to be what keeps people around. And I think this is particularly so of the generation of students who are coming through who are not going to jump for necessarily more money. They're going to go to the organizations that they feel value them the most and treat them, and they focus on wellness and things like that. And so you have to listen to your employees and what they're telling you. And then you have to, as a leader, you have to create these cultures that are based on trust and embracing new opportunities. And so for my organization, it's really been about a major shift to thinking about wellness as not a means to an end, because in many cases, we had really focused on wellness because wellness makes people happy. Happy people provide better customer service. Better customer service means we have better service. And that means that our users are going to benefit the most from what we do. Now, I believe that wellness is an end unto itself. It's critical that people are well, not because it makes them good workers, but because it's good, humane thing to do. All right, so we covered those 4 areas. And so how are libraries going to respond right now? That's the question. We all work in libraries right now. And I would say the first thing, it always starts at the top and thinking about inclusive leadership, right? And even if you're not at the top of your organization, you can always demonstrate inclusive leadership. And so for us at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, after the murder of George Floyd and the pandemic and all these things that were going on, we did launch a major diversity initiative called the Reckoning Initiative. And one of the things that we had really focused on was about, are we leading in an inclusive way, right? And who's in the room, who's not in the room, who makes the decisions, how do we be more inclusive? And so that means treating people equitably and within your organization and within your team. And I'm largely speaking about my leadership team. And then also it's the sense of belonging and value. Do people feel like this organization cares about them? They value them, respect them. And then the third part is you could do those first 2. You could treat them well, they belong, but if you're not giving them the resources to support them and so they can reach their fullest potential, those first 2 don't mean anything. So inclusive leadership is one of the things, but inclusive management and being an inclusive member of your organization is really, of course, critical. But I think that the part that's going to be most difficult is how we reimagine the dynamics between employers and employees. That's the tough part. And I think I still have another year of really working on this to understand how do we do this very differently. And the reason why it's so hard is we have these obstacles. We have an HR policy, which really is not it's not the most what's the word? It's not a policy that's focused on wellness and empathy. There are often policies that are focused on avoiding risk, right? And that's always a problem. And so later on, I'm going to talk about like the HR is something you're really going to have to look deep within to see what you're going to be able to do with your HR. The other one, of course, is budgetary and financial constraints. Many of us are really struggling in our organizations with our budgets. And a lot of these things we want to do cost money. And so you got to figure out a way how to get it done with the resources you have. The third one, which I think is important, is I think we lack the creativity, imagination, and the know-how to reimagine this partnership between employee and employer. And then finally, I don't know about you, but I was trained in a command and control culture, right? It's like the supervisor sets the goals, tells people what to do, is clear about the expectations, and then is makes people accountable, and then doles out punishment when those things aren't done. That's command and control. That's the way I was trained. And learning how to not be a command and control leader is really hard, but it's incredibly necessary if you want to be inclusive. And it's incredibly necessary if you want to attract new talent. So the opportunities I see is that you have to look at your HR policy. Now, as I already mentioned, I'm subject to the rules of the UNC system, but I still have some possibilities to look at the local policies of my own organization. And so how we do promotion and appointment, I have some control over. I have some control over reclassification. I have some control over the practices and policies and procedures. And so what can you change that's under your control? And in some cases, I feel so strongly about them, I want to go to the UNC system and say, hey, this policy isn't helping us. Can you change it? And here are the reasons why I think you should change it. Second area is, as I mentioned, our Reckoning initiative. A big part of that is equity. And so when you look at your organization and you're looking at people based on their identities, are people being paid a wage that is commensurate with the work they do and the amount of service that they have provided? That's important work that needs to get done. However, keep in mind that you could do that work and still have a lot more work to do, because you always have to look at the market and to understand that if you're an organization where most people are underpaid, then an equity analysis is not going to necessarily result in people getting money, because everybody in the organization is underpaid, right? And then you lift up the organization, but they're still not where they need to be. So that's kind of the situation I'm in, where, you know, the equity work is really difficult, and you have to include the market in order to get people the salaries that I think are consistent to live in this area. And then I think the other part that I've often had to explain is that there are university-wide and system-wide policies that, as I mentioned, are not under my control, that I'm committed to trying to change, but often constrain and restrict what you're able to do. And then I also think that our management, you know, as I mentioned, is typically trained in command and control. HR is trained in liability prevention. So how do we retrain managers and HR people on thinking about the employee-employer relationship in a very different kind of way? So what are the things you could do? As I mentioned, you have to get training. So over the pandemic, you know, we set up basically a wellness team, and we had a lot of conversations within our department heads group. What does wellness look like? How do we center it? How do we learn how to lead with compassion and empathy? And that took a lot of time. I mean, just trying to manage people when we weren't working on site was really difficult. And then you had to really focus on, are people well? Are they able to work? I mean, when you look at the Maslow's triangle, I assure you, particularly in the middle of the pandemic, if people's basic needs aren't being met, I can assure you that they're not going to be productive at work, right? So that was one of the things we talked about. And we still haven't found the training that we think that our managers need, but we're still working on it. And then I would say that your HR unit is really important, and that if you have someone in HR who's willing to rethink the dynamic between staff and HR and staff and library administration in a very meaningful, powerful, inclusive way, then you are really going to be ahead of the game. And that's something, again, that HR is a lot about transactions and rules, but it's also fundamentally about people. And so you have to figure out ways to get people to be inspired, people to who are committed and dedicated to work to continue doing that. So the steps to take mid to long term. You have to go back and look at each and every HR policy to see if it's designed for inclusion and if you could center wellness within that policy. For example, your leave policy, looking at the policy for reclassing staff. You have to look at each and everything you do, how you hire, promotion. What do you do when you appoint someone? All those things have to be reviewed. The second thing you have to do is you have to listen to your staff and understand what their challenges are, what are their lived experiences, and try to understand where they're coming from. The third is you have to look at the compensation. I know at my organization, this is by far the biggest problem that people have. People felt that they were earnest, they showed up in this pandemic, they did great work, and yet they're not being compensated, or they're not being compensated fairly. And so you have to be committed to looking at how you can measure and assess compensation and then find a way to compensate people in a much better way. And that's the challenge that we're having at my institution. Is this is a major problem, given that our HR unit is not always helpful in this regard. And so we have to figure out ways in the midst of major budget cuts. The fourth area is a lot of us have these exit interviews, and it's kind of too late to interview people once they're out the door. So in some ways, you have to really start at the beginning. And so that onboarding process is like an entry interview, and you figure out what got people there, right? And then you have to figure out what keeps people. And then you also have to figure out what pushes people out of the organization. And so you have to do all three. But I do know even just exit interviews, a lot of our institutions, they do the interviews and they go on a file cabinet and no one ever sees them ever again. They're not being used to improve your organization, right? And if you're not using it to improve your organization, you might as well not do it at all. And then finally, mentoring is really important. If you don't have a mentoring program, you have to think about setting one up. But I have to caution you, if you don't have the resources, you can't do it well, do not set up a mentoring program, because they need a lot of energy, a lot of resources. And I've been, including my own institution, where we've had a mentoring program come and go. And it's something that's super frustrating for myself. It's like, I want a really robust program that is helping the people who are coming in my organization and helping them understand the culture, what makes things tick, how they get stuff done, how they get their ideas across. So in the short term, how do we identify ways to reduce the workload for our overworked staff? One of the things that I've been reading about is that these call centers, the shifts were way too long. I'm going to move my computer. The light is coming in. There we go. Nope, it's just worse. Nope. Oh, it's a little bit better. Okay. But how is there a way for people who are working on the front lines with the public to get breaks and not be on that front line as long as they are? And the other thing is temporarily or permanently reducing tasks that have a low return on investment. So I have an HR team, they are overwhelmed. And we just at some point have to say, we have to stop doing certain things because they're not really benefiting us at the moment. And I think actually one of the things we have to do is stop the exit interviews because, it just wasn't giving us that return on investment. Now we're going to go back to it at some point, but right now, if we're not able to do it well, then we might as well not do it. And that's one less thing the team has to focus on. Number two, how do you recognize and demonstrate respect for your staff? Do you have an awards or rewards program where you can recognize people for the amazing work that they're doing? And not just individuals, but can you recognize teams of people who are doing really good work? And I think there's social events, and that's kind of mixed because, sometimes people just don't want to do that. But are there appreciation days where you can voice your appreciation for folks? And then number three, is mental health has to be a priority. About, I would say about a month ago, we had 3 students at my university commit suicide. That shook this campus, and as well it should. And so we have to not only just look at the mental health of our students, but our faculty and staff have to prioritize mental health. We have to focus on prevention. If we could go back and undo those suicides, we could, but you have to prevent this from happening. And so we set up a wellness group at the beginning of the pandemic. And as far as I'm concerned, we'll continue these activities once the pandemic is over, because people need to be opportunities to de-stress, to relax, to meditate, and to do things that should help them deal with the stress of their everyday work. Sorry, I have this glow coming in. I'm going to try to move my computer. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay. And then the final thing, which I already mentioned, is mentoring matters. And even if you don't have a formal mentoring program, if you could just, you're an employee, go to someone you respect and ask them to be your mentor, or go outside of your organization and find someone whom you respect and see if they'd be willing to mentor you. And that would change the way you look at your organization, the stories you tell about yourself, about what you do in that organization, how you perform. That would be tremendously helpful. All right, so I'm wrapping up here. Oh, that is actually the end of my presentation. So we have about 9 minutes, I believe, Amelia, if I think that's correct, to see what kind of questions any of the audience has about my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions or comments or feedback. I'd love to hear what you're doing at your organizations to keep people and to really make it an environment where people can thrive. Amelia, it looked like you were about to say something.
No, just to confirm the timing, and folks, if you want to unmute, feel free, or use chat, whichever works.
Thank you, Carrie, for the feedback. So someone says it's really hard to envision that the changing the nature of library services going forward. I agree. It's really endemic to our organizations, and I think it's easy to have apathy, and it's easy to basically say, like, what does this look like? And I think it's going to be really, really, really difficult, because I think even our organizations now, and my organization is a fairly big organization, where we still struggle with ensuring that we are able to get people doing the most relevant, important work in our organization, because the jobs are changing so much that people aren't able to perform at the levels that are now expected of them. So I agree, this is super, super difficult. And I think if we don't start thinking about this now, over the next 5 years, it's going to be more difficult. I mean, there are always going to be people who go to library school, but quite frankly, I'm not as worried about the librarians. I'm worried about everyone else who are critical to running a library. It's all the other staff that are so important, and how we're going to attract that talent and keep them. Yeah, so there's more and more emphasis on e-resources. Yes, we're definitely, during the pandemic, we did a, what do we call it? Gosh, I'm blanking on it, but we focused on electronic books and e-resources, because those are one thing that people could use in the middle of the pandemic. And so I think it was E-first or E-preferred is what we called it. So there's a comment about the stress. Yeah, patrons are stressful. The news is stressful. I would love to have a room with board games and Switch. Yeah, this is something I've been looking at because it's like during the pandemic, we had to shut down our staff lounge. And then it's like, well, where could people go? And so that's something I'm definitely interested in, particularly for people who work with the staff. So you're on that desk and that patron who you all know comes in and drives people crazy. Is there a place for you? Can you get off the desk? Can you de-stress? Are there things that we could do that are going to help? Because it's funny when I tell people I'm a librarian and I go out, they act as if it's impossible for our environment to be stressful. And I always say, oh, it's extremely stressful. And then you have to, like, you know, are you policing mass? You know, you got the printers, you got all these things you're dealing with. That's super stressful. How do we make it so that these folks can really contribute, do things that they love to do, but also have to manage for that 1 or 2% people who really make our lives pretty difficult on the job. Okay, so it says I mentioned 5% more salary and signing bonuses to hire new workers. Where did that information come from? Yes, I have. I should have put the list of articles in here. Since I know you, Lauren, I'm going to send it to you. But this is, I can't remember which article it was, and I'm sorry, I should have cited it. But it was very clear that there's a high chance that you're going to get a 5% increase whenever you move on. And it could be in the same organization, but that's generally what they're finding. But I don't have the citation, but I read a gazillion articles, and I'm not sure. One of them was a really good one from University of Texas. And then there's a bunch of Fortune magazine has written a lot about the Great Resignation. New York Times, ProPublica has written a couple of articles about it, but I'll find the citation and post it, or I can give it to Amelia and she could send it to everyone who's attending. That'd be the easiest thing, is if I add a page with all the citations, then all of you could take a look at it. Okay. Well, in the last 2 minutes, I just hope that all of you are doing okay. And in light of this inflation, the stress, the pandemic, which is not over, I hope people are taking care of themselves, and I hope you're able to work within your organization to create a better environment. And to me, that really is the most important thing that libraries could do, and that leaders could do, and managers could do, is to create an environment where people can be safe, people can be authentic, who they are, and people can feel like they can contribute, and they actually have some power and influence in the organization. So, so thank you once again. And if you have any questions, you can always Google me and find me online, but I'll promise that I'll add the list of citations, articles for all of you that NC Live will share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine.